We've opened the previous chapter with For What It's Worth, the Buffalo Springfield record that called on the youth to stop and look around, and try to change what is wrong. And we've ended the chapter with seeing how this new attitude led some hippies to go into politics, in the form of the Yippies. Most of the infamy of the Yippies was won during the Democratic Party Convention of 1968, which took place in Chicago. The Yippies announced that they will simultaneously hold a 7-day festival in Chicago, which will feature some prominent rock bands. They also promised some pranks and surprises, such as dumping LSD into the water supply so all people in Chicago will be high, and create a groovy atmosphere that will ensure that the convention will yield good decisions. They were joking, of course, but the authorities panicked, and the atmosphere around the convention was anything but groovy. It caused all the rock bands, save one which we shall later discuss, to pull out of the festival. During the event, the anxious police arrested the festival's organizers, who became known as the Chicago Eight. Graham Nash, from the British band The Hollies, was inspired by it to write this song.
So your brother's bound and gagged, and they've chained him to a chair. Won't you please come to Chicago just to sing? In a land that's known as freedom, how can such a thing be fair? Won't you please come to Chicago for the help that we can bring? We can change the world. Rearrange the world is dying. To get better.
We can change the world, rearrange the world, he sings. Again we encounter the revolutionary spirit, the deep-seated belief that the values of the counterculture are the best values, the values society should be based on, and that they are going to win in the end. But the presidential elections ended with the left losing, and with a new Republican president named Richard Nixon, who was even more opposed to the counterculture's values. Moreover, Nixon was a man with a paranoid disposition, who regarded the opposition as a danger to the future of America, and was willing to use all means to stop it. His administration was intolerant to the counterculture, and escalated the conflict. One of the most horrific moments came in 1970, when National Guard forces opened fire on protesters in the Kent State University in Ohio, and killed 4 of them. Meanwhile, Graham Nash teamed up with Stephen Stills, the man who wrote For What It's Worth, and along with Stills' Buffalo Springfield buddy Neil Young, and David Crosby from the Byrds, they formed Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. After the Ohio event, the group released this single, written by Young.
Tin soldiers and Nixon coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it, soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago.
As we can hear, the optimistic spirit we heard in the previous record gives way to desperation and militancy, and the government is depicted as an enemy. This is what happened to the 60s youth when they ignored Ken Kesey's warning, advising them to turn their back on the old game and just focus on changing consciousness, and instead turn to radical political activism. Very quickly, they were deep in the old game, deep in violence. But the people we've discussed until now at least had a positive attitude. The revolutionary activity came from having a culture that made them happy, and which they wanted to bestow on the rest of the world, believing it will bring happiness to everyone. The aforementioned militant records of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were exceptions in the band's work, which focused mainly on developing the counterculture's values and discussing its inner problems. But we've already mentioned that there is another type of people. People for whom life is suffering, and they are looking for happiness in something external to it. When people of this type turn to revolutionary political activism, they do it not out of love for humankind, but out of hate for the existing order. And there were also people like that in the 60s. You could already hear the portents during the Summer of Love, if you listened carefully enough. Throughout that summer, the first place on the album chart was preserved to Sgt. Pepper, but the second place rotated between several albums, which have also become classics. One of them was an album that actually came out in January, and was meddling along for months, until this single out of it was released and started burning the charts.
Know that it would be untrue. Know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire.
Light My Fire still belongs to what we discussed in the previous chapters, and is one of the greatest anthems of the sexual revolution, along with the singer who brought rock and roll sexiness to new heights. The name of the band, too, belongs to the psychedelic mindset, taken from the William Blake line about the Doors of Perception, the same line that inspired Aldous Huxley. But the Doors, led by Jim Morrison, didn't just want to cleanse the doors of perception so that they can experience the world as it is. They wanted to bust through these doors to get to the other side, and what is beyond this world.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, yeah.
I found an island in your arms, country in your eyes, sings Morrison. This is in line with hippie ideology, the belief that love between humans is above all, and anyone who experiences it needs nothing more. But then, he immediately lashes out against it.
I found an island in your arms, country in your eyes, arms and chains, eyes and lines, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through, oh yeah!
Love, he tells us, is nothing but an illusion, which prevents us from reaching happiness. If we want to find happiness, we need to liberate ourselves from the things that chain us to this world, such as love, and try to break to the other side.
Break on through to the other side, break on through, break on through, break on through, break on through, hey, 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 hey.
All the people we've discussed so far believe that happiness is achievable in this world. Morrison and the Doors constitute something new to us, an attempt to penetrate through reality, to get to something that lies beyond the world. Of course, when I say new, I mean new to our story, because in human history this is actually the dominant approach, the approach that claims that happiness cannot be found in this world but in heaven. And in the modern age, dominated by secular thought, the belief is that happiness isn't reachable now, but will be in the future, when humankind progresses to a higher level. The hippies tried to break out of this dogma and learn to live for today, but in the previous chapter we saw them falling back into an approach that seeks happiness in the future, and that opened the door to the Doors. The greatest influence on Morrison were the so-called damned poets, 19th century poets who were perceived as people who have been cursed with a nature different from that of normal humans, but a nature that enables us to learn more about man. Through their poetry, they presumably opened the window to the other side, to the thing we can't perceive rationally, and thus allowed us to study it and develop a better understanding of ourselves. Morrison perceived himself as a damned poet, working within the rock music field. Another influence was a book written by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche about Greek tragedy. Nietzsche claimed that a tragic hero is someone who expresses nature rising against a man-made law and breaking it. The hero pays a heavy price for this transgression, but his actions allow the human race to establish a new and more harmonic system, and everyone benefits from it. As an example, he presents Oedipus, a man who pays an awful price for breaking the most sacred laws, but eventually also brings blessing to those around him. Morrison wanted to be a tragic hero of that type. The epic record, The End, starts out with slow and quiet music, meandering sluggishly and creating a mysterious and dramatic atmosphere. Morrison bids farewell to his friends, farewell to this world of love and pain, which he defines as wilderness. He observes that all kids live in anticipation of something else, and claims that they are insane. He does not intend to wait, but to go out and find the answer on his own. He goes out of city limits, out of the known and safe world, to the unknown, and calls on us to join him there. There, we go on a blue bus, and for a moment we feel like we are in a regular psychedelic trip, as the music becomes an acid rock merry-go-round. But for Morrison, the psychedelic trip is not an answer either, and he jumps off the bus, to go much further than the hippies ever dreamed of. In the next segment, he performs an Oedipal ritual, in which he murders his father and fucks his mother, setting himself free of all rules and conventions of human society. From that point, the music loses form, and becomes an explosion into space, as his soul sails into the beyond. Before the end, he sends us some more farewell wishes, and tells us that he knows that we will never follow him into these realms, which means that this is the end of his life as part of society. But Morrison still wanted to get others to follow him, to take them to the other side, and believed he could do so with his art. Another influential figure was Antonin Artaud, the subversive French playwright who operated in the 30s and 40s. Artaud claimed that the attitude dominating theatre, which sees the script as the art and the role of the actors as merely to present it, prevents theatre from being an expression of truth. The performance, he said, is where the creative act should take place, and the actor on stage should regard themselves as an artist creating something on the spot. He believed that the actor should express nature erupting and breaking the molds that the human mind imposes on it. And nature, he claimed, is ruled by cruelty. When it erupts, it causes destruction, ugliness and misery. But once the eruption is over, a new order sets in place, better and prettier than the one before. Theatre, then, should be a theatre of cruelty, and the actors should present something violent and ugly, which will shock the audience and break the molds in their minds. Artaud tried to implement his ideas, but society thought him insane and locked him up in an insane asylum, where he spent the war years. Still, his gospel percolated through culture, and was carried further by others. We've already met one of his disciples, namely Carl Solomon, the beatnik who committed himself to a mental ward, and there, through Allen Ginsberg, changed the course of history. Theatre was influenced as well, and in the US it was through a troupe that called itself the Living Theatre, which wanted to reflect life as it is, with all its cruelty and ugliness, without the gloss that theatre usually gives it. Morrison was much affected by the Living Theatre, and wanted to take their attitude into his art, to turn his rock shows into a theatrical performance that will rattle the youth, take it out of its stupor and make it search for truth. The unknown soldiers about the war, which we treat with indifference, watch on TV while we eat our breakfast, not spending much thought on the soldiers whose young lives are being lost. To shake us out of our indifference, Morrison cruelly dramatizes the song, turning those unknown soldiers into convicts led to the gallows. With the escalating Vietnam War in the background, and the growing doubts in its necessity, this performance had a lot of power. And Morrison had something the theatre people did not: a mighty rock band to back him up. The Doors were unique among rock bands in not having a bass player, but instead they had the virtuoso keyboardist Ray Manzarek, the first rocker to fully realize the potential of electric keyboard. Electric keyboard technology improved fast in the 60s, giving musicians the ability to produce a myriad of new sounds, and Manzarek used his Vox Continental organ to great psychedelic effect. When they wanted to do rhythmic rock and roll, he played the bass part with his keyboard. But on other numbers he would improvise, and along with jazz-trained guitarist Robbie Krieger and drummer John Densmore, create something that sounded like acid rock, and yet different and unique. Most importantly, their flexibility allowed them to provide a powerful and dramatic soundtrack to the show put by their frontman. Morrison turned the Doors' performances into a combination of music, poetry and theatre, sometimes being the thrilling and sexy rock and roll singer, sometimes a poet improvising poetry on the spot, and sometimes an actor putting on a play. And the band was always with him, responding to his improvisations and providing the suitable musical backdrop. With the power of the Doors, Morrison put on provocative shows that generated scandals, and resulted in repeated run-ins with the law. But through that, the Doors took the art of rock a step forward, and showed how far it can go. One of the most demonstrative numbers of the Doors' rock theatre is When the Music's Over. It's a record that talks about music as the essence of life, the thing without which life has no value. But in the course of its 10 minutes playtime, it gets into other alleys. In one, Morrison becomes an Indian shaman, who lives in harmony with nature and decries the destruction humans wreak upon it. This is in line with the environmentalist approach of the counterculture, which we mentioned in the previous chapter, and there we said that it was a starting point for a political struggle to save the environment. This is not Morrison's solution. The shaman puts his ear to the ground, and tells us that he hears a demand rising from the depths of the youth's subconscious, a demand that the youth is perhaps unaware of, until Morrison screams it in their ears.
We want the world and we want it now. Right, Mama? Now.
We want the world, and we want it now. The idea of gradual progress towards salvation no longer satisfies us. Western culture detached us from nature, detached us from the world, and we want to reconnect to it, via a revolution that will destroy the ruling system. While the other big rock bands rejected violent revolution, the Doors reveled in it, and Morrison used the stage to call upon the youth to stand up and act. The revolution, he said, will come. The Doors, then, were different from the people we discussed until now. They didn't express a will to spread their inner truth to the world, but to violently smash the lie of reality. Their revolutionary attitude came from the same place. But the Doors at least took these emotions and turned them into monumental art, which we still enjoy today and will continue to enjoy for years to come. The same cannot be said about other violent revolutionaries of the time, whose hate and aggression turned 1968 and the following years into a bloodfest. And what stood behind it all was Marxism. Marxism arose out of the dialectic thought of the 19th century, which believed that humanity's progress towards utopia is achieved through a perpetual struggle between oppressor and oppressed. In every stage of development there is a certain system in place, and this system includes an oppressing class and an oppressed class. At some point, the ground is ready for something better, and then the oppressed class revolts and imposes a new system. This new system is superior, in that it is less oppressive and it makes life better for everyone, but it is still divided into oppressor and oppressed classes. Karl Marx believed that we are now at the penultimate stage, and that the next revolution will bring the final stage, where there will be no more oppression. The prevailing system now is capitalism, and it is creating enormous wealth, but it is also an unfair system in which the bourgeoisie employers are oppressing the working class, which enjoys only a tiny portion of the wealth. At some point, the capitalist system will create enough wealth to provide for everyone's needs, and then the working class will revolt and create a classless society, where there is no commodity but everyone shares the wealth. Thus, humanity will achieve utopia. As we already mentioned in previous chapters, in the 19th century Marxism was rooted in reality. The working class was very poor and exploited, and suffered as a result. Marxism was a humanist way of thinking, which gave expression to these sufferings, and because of that, it could also be the basis of good art. But as the decades went on, capitalism managed to actually improve the lives of working class people in the West, and they no longer suffer but focus more on achieving happiness. Marxists, however, refuse to acknowledge that things are better. Since they believe that the nature of man is to live in a classless society, the fact that current society is getting better is actually perceived by them as less freedom, since it delays the revolution. Marxism no longer speaks for the real emotions of humans, but became a purely theoretical ideology, based on blind faith in Marx. The Marxists believe that only they know what the people truly want, and that most people are not aware of their actual will, since the capitalist system is creating distractions for them. From a humanist way of thinking that loved humankind, Marxism became a system of thought based on hate. Hatred towards the bourgeoisie, who are perceived as people that are actively working to maintain the working class in its wretched state. Hatred towards all earthly pleasures, which are perceived as distractions that prevent us from achieving true happiness. And hatred towards the human race, that refuses to see what the Marxists see. Marxism ceased creating humanism and beauty, and became a way of thinking that corrupts and destroys anything it touches. The last Marxist artist that was worth anything was the playwright Bertolt Brecht, who began working in the 1910s. Brecht claimed that theater plays, which are designed to make the viewer forget himself and lose himself in the play, are the sort of distractions that prevent humans from seeing the truth. Therefore, he created devices to shake his viewers out of their trance and look at reality with open eyes. In the Threepenny Opera, there is a scene in which our gaze is suddenly turned towards the maid Jenny, who is singing her song.
Meine Herren, heute sehen Sie mich gläsern abwaschen und ich mache das Bett für jeden. Und Sie geben mir einen Penny und ich bedanke mich schnell und Sie sehen meine Lumpen und das lumpige Hotel und Sie wissen nicht, mit wem Sie reden. Und Sie wissen nicht, mit wem Sie reden. Aber eines Tages wird ein Geschrei sein am Hafen und man fragt, was ist das für ein Geschrei? Und man wird mich lächeln sehen bei meinen Gläsern. Und man fragt, was lächelten die dabei? Und ein Schiff mit 8 Segeln und mit 50 Kanonen wird liegen am Kai.
At the end, when the pirates take over the city, Jenny is asked what should be done with the former masters.
Es werden kommen 100 gegen Mittag an Land und werden in den Schatten treten und fangen einen jeglichen vor jeglicher Tür und legen ihn Ketten und bringen ihn mir und mich fragen, welchen sollen wir töten? Und mich fragen, welchen sollen wir töten? Und an diesem Mittag wird es still sein am Hafen, wenn man fragt, wer wohl sterben muss. Und da werden sie mich sagen hören, alle. Und wenn dann der Kopf fällt, sage ich, hoppla. Und das Schiff mit 8 Segeln und mit 50 Kanonen wird entschwinden mit mir.
This, according to Marxists, is what the working class actually feels. They serve their employers with a smile, but deep down, they wish for a battleship to come and wipe them all out. The hate that Marxists feel in their heart, they project on the entire working class, for whom they presume to speak. Brecht, as we see, also suffers from this sick way of thinking. But what nevertheless turns his early plays into masterpieces is the music, because he still allowed himself to use pop music, the music of the working class, to convey his message. The music was provided by Kurt Weill, and was very influential on the development of 20th century pop. This was even acknowledged by The Doors, who covered the Brecht-Weill song in their first album, as a symbol of the merger of rock and theatre. But after the 1920s, no Marxist would even entertain the thought of using pop music to express themselves. Marxism completely detached from the spirit of the time. Those years saw the rise of a new school of Marxist thought, known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School philosophers focused on criticizing the capitalist system, and the ways in which it allegedly enslaves us and prevents us from living out our true nature. One of the main ways by which it distracts the public, declared these philosophers, is pop music, which was therefore denounced as an enemy of the human spirit. If you want a classic real-life example of Dylan's Mr. Jones, of a scholar who writes about a subject he has zero comprehension of, check out Theodor Adorno's writings on pop music. Even though pop music is created and consumed mainly by working class people, those people whose interests Marxists claim to represent, Marxist thought turned against it. Working class people are a lot more multifaceted than the way that Marxist theory portrays them, and the pop music that they create attests to it. Pop is not painting an ideal man which it projects on everyone, but expresses the feelings and deeds of real people in their everyday lives, describing them in their endless multiplicity, without judging. Rather than dreaming of some ship that will come and save us, pop discovers more and more pleasures in everyday reality, and makes it ever more rich, diverse and joyful. Furthermore, by giving a voice to the discriminated groups, and allowing them to be consumed by mainstream society, it helps them become more socially acceptable, and makes society more equal. And so, while Marxists spend their time trying to convince people that their lives are actually bad, and in idle and destructive thoughts on how to bring down the current system, pop makes our lives more fun, and at the same time changes our world for the better. But Marxist thought infiltrated pop as well, and started to eat at it from the inside. A good example is what happened to folk music, which at first was a happy manifestation of regular folks and celebrated songs written by working people who sang about their lives. By the middle of the 20th century, however, Marxism penetrated folk, and impoverished its spirit. Folkies began to disqualify songs that they perceived as an inauthentic expression of the working class spirit, and even disqualify certain styles. These actions severely dented folk's humanist spirit. The folkies took active part in the human rights movement, fighting to achieve equality for black Americans, following the belief that all humans should be equal. But at the same time, they disqualified expressions of black identity, which did not comply with their perception of humanity. And so, rhythm and blues singers, who mostly liked to dress snazzy and play electric music, had to switch to working clothes, sandals and acoustic instruments when they came to play in folk festivals, to appear in the way that folkies perceived an authentic black person. The Marxist hateful and violent fantasies also found their way into folk. This is Bob Dylan, when he was still part of the movement, singing his own song about a ship that will come and save us, and kill all the so-called masters.
Like the stillness in the wind before the hurricane begins, the hour that the ship comes in.
By the 60s, Marxist thought reached total bankruptcy. One of the popular books of the decade was One-Dimensional Man, by Frankfurt Scholar Herbert Marcuse, and it is a perfect example of the shallowness which dialectic thought leads to. Our daily life is enormously varied and multidimensional, containing many levels of joy and suffering, and numerous experiences that are all different from one another. But one whose mind is enslaved to Marxist thought, like Marcuse, perceives only two dimensions: the dimension of truth, the one we should aspire to, and the false dimension which we live in. And since he perceives everyday life as a false dimension, the Marxist doesn't see any difference between one experience to the next, and does not experience the different levels of joy and suffering. His daily existence becomes completely flat and one-dimensional. In his book, Marcuse claims that contemporary culture no longer tries to reach the true dimension, which in his perception leaves only the false dimension of everyday reality. That is why he asserts that humans have become one-dimensional. In fact, the book only displays the shallow two-dimensionality of its author. But the rebellious spirit of the time reinvigorated dialectic thought, gave it power, and many youngsters read Marcuse while listening to the folk singers. By the second half of the 60s, Marxism devolved into pure infantilism. Many of the revolutionaries adopted the belief that the human race can live in a utopian world, and the only ones preventing it are a certain group of people that is currently in control. The moment we get rid of them, they believed, the good human nature will take over, and the world will live in peace and harmony. In 1968, this attitude exploded in the face of the world, in many ugly ways. Let's begin with feminism. We've seen that in the 60s, women too were challenging traditional notions, expressing themselves in new ways, and breaking into places that hitherto were closed before them. But along with this feminism, the 60s also saw the rise of dialectic feminism, which claimed that men are controlling the world and oppressing women, and we must fight them. This dialectic feminism was dripping with hate towards men, and also with hate towards many feminine customs, which they claimed are imposed on women by men as part of the scheme to enslave them. This feminism made many women feel ashamed in things that brought them pleasure, because they were allegedly betraying their true nature, which is supposed to not like those things. And it also taught them to hate the women who were not ashamed of their pleasures. The most extreme case was Valerie Solanas, a young American who wrote a manifesto that describes men as a genetic mutation that oppresses women and destroys humanity, a mutation that must be eradicated. Even so, a man took fancy to her, and that man was none other than Andy Warhol, the famed pop artist. Warhol's studio in New York was a hanging place for the unique and bizarre people he gathered around him, to get inspiration for his works, and became one of the symbols of the carefree spirit of the 60s. When he met Solanas, he liked her weirdness, and naturally invited her to be one of the regulars in his studio. Solanas, in return, came in time to regard Warhol as a symbol of the masculine authority she must fight against, and in June 1968 she came to the studio armed with a pistol, and hit him with 3 bullets. He miraculously survived, but the free atmosphere in the studio was irrevocably destroyed, as it was in the world around it. The public shock over Warhol's shooting was relatively small, because the media was busy with another assassination that happened 2 days later, and had more fatal results. Senator Robert Kennedy, the Democratic nominee for presidency that might have defeated Nixon, was shot dead by a Palestinian assassin who was angry about his sympathetic attitude towards Israel. And this was just one manifestation of the change that took place in Palestinian consciousness at the time. This was the year which saw the writing of the notorious Second Palestinian Charter, which basically defines Zionism as the manifestation of evil on earth, which needs to be eradicated by any means. Dialectic thought took over the Palestinian national movement, and would determine its rhetoric and action for many years, with disastrous results. And even that wasn't the most famous assassination that year. 2 months before that, black leader Martin Luther King was murdered by a white racist, a murder that seemed to have killed the hope for reconciliation between the races. King, the head figure in the civil rights movement, championed the non-violence struggle, and his pacifist message had a massive influence on the peace-love ideology of the counterculture. His death pretty much killed the ideology of non-violence, leaving the stage for more violent expressions of black activism. One of the main Black Power movements were the Black Panthers, a movement that described the relationship between blacks and whites in a dialectic way, and its members called upon the black community to arm and defend themselves against white oppression. Only 5 years have passed since Martin Luther King relayed his dream of blacks and whites living together, and the black revolutionaries were now talking about killing Whitey. The US was not the only place suffering from violence in 1968. Europe was no less tumultuous. In West Germany, a new young generation of students began to criticize the past and rebel against its parents, and was thus very susceptible to revolutionary Marxism. In France, the agitation among the students almost caused the revolution, as for 3 days in May the country was overtaken by chaos, until the government managed to restore order. Naturally, the events in France scared governments the world over, and further reduced their tolerance towards youth rebellion and protests. And so, Marxism and dialectic thought destroyed the magical spirit of the previous year's Summer of Love, and dragged Western youth in the direction of pointless violence. In the East, meanwhile, it crushed even harder. The communist regimes of the USSR and China used dialectic thought in order to rule, and keep their subjects under their heel. The regime presented itself as the manifestation of the workers' revolution, and anyone who wouldn't obey it was branded as a bourgeoisie, and therefore as an enemy that deserves to die. Many earthly pleasures were censored, since pleasures are a bourgeois thing, and the fact that there was still suffering was blamed on bourgeois residues that have not been cleaned up yet, so we must give the government more power in order to clean them. But in the 60s, rock and roll managed to infiltrate the Iron Curtain, and bring the vital spirit of the time to Eastern Europe as well, showing the youth that there is something better than both communism and capitalism. In Czechoslovakia, this fermentation led to the Prague Spring, during which the government gave more freedoms to the public, under the title Socialism with a Human Face. But even that was too much for the Soviets, and in August 1968 Russian tanks rolled into Prague and trampled the spring in its infancy. But the country that suffered the most that year was Vietnam, where the long-running war escalated even further. Vietnam was the field where two arrogant worldviews clashed. The American worldview, which believes everyone in the world wants to be an American, and the communist worldview, which holds that everyone wants to be a communist. The Americans were sure that they were destined to win, but in January 1968, the Communist North launched a surprise attack that became known as the Tet Offensive, and inflicted heavy losses on their enemy. The South and the Americans managed to drive back the offensive, but the confidence of the American public was shaken, and the anti-war voices grew louder. The protests became even more rowdy and violent. What part did rock music play in all of these developments? Well, as we've mentioned, rock was already expressing a generation with a new consciousness, which was contemptuous to the old ways of thinking, including to dialectic thinking. The big rock bands refused to support violent revolutionary action, and the ways in which they handled the subject will be discussed in upcoming episodes. Those bands that did write songs about political revolution, like Jefferson Airplane, The Doors or Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, did so, as we've seen, not from a Marxist dialectic perspective, but from a more complex worldview. There was, however, one cultural artifact that did make the connection between rock and revolution. It was a B-movie, a trashy rock musical called Wild in the Streets, that gained cult status. Released in 1968, it is about a youth idol rock star who rebels against the system, and eventually adopts a dialectic ideology which blames adults for all the wrongs in the world, and leads the youth to revolt against them. The hero is basically a combination of all 60s revolutionary movements, an amalgamation of Jim Morrison, the Yippies, the French students and so forth. He is an interesting speculation on what could have happened if rock wasn't built on healthier foundations.
There's a new sun rising up angry in the sky, and there's a new voice crying, "We're not afraid to die. Let the old world make believe it's blind and deaf and dumb, but nothing can change the shape of things to come."
And there was actually one authentic rock band that did espouse a revolutionary ideology. They hailed from Detroit, and were managed by John Sinclair, a Marxist who formed the White Panthers, a white militant group that identified with the Black Panthers. The name of the band was Motor City 5, or MC5 for short, and they adopted their manager's ideology. MC5 displayed the rebellious power of rock music, playing chaotic and anarchic rock and roll, an explosion of raw energy that was a decade ahead of its time. They took an active part in all the protests and anti-establishment events, and were the only band that dared to come and play in the festival arranged by the Yippies during the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Their signature record was Kick Out the Jams, first performed, naturally, in 1968.
I know how you want it, flower with that light. The girls stand standing with the woolly right. And then up on the stand, and let them kick out the jam. Jam, kick out the jam.
Here's something more politically explicit. Motor City is Burning is a rework of a song by legendary bluesman John Lee Hooker, a song decrying the 1967 Detroit riots, when African Americans started rioting and burned down the houses in their own Black Quarter. MC5, however, turned it into a fantasy in which the people of the city are uprising. In contrast with the atmosphere of desperation and sadness in Hooker's record, here the air is euphoric. The thoughts of violence, chaos and destruction fill the revolutionary soul with joy. But MC5, again, was a marginal and outstanding band in the rock world, which mostly turned its back on revolutionary action based on dialectic thought. The revolutionaries, on the other hand, drew from the power of rock, and presumed to be the real conveyors of its rebellious mood. The Black Panthers, for instance, read their manifesto with Bob Dylan's Ballad of the Thin Man playing in the background. 1969 already saw the rise of the Weathermen, a revolutionary group that took its name from a line in Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues. The Weathermen took the dialectic logic one step further, and turned to terrorism to achieve their goals. The logic was simple. Since human nature is good, and the system is the cause of all the bad ills in the world, then all we have to do is create chaos that will bring its downfall, and a new harmonic order will just rise naturally. True, people will die on the way, but it is a small price to pay for the achievement of utopia. The coming years will see the rise of more terrorist groups, which all had that same idiotic logic. One of the heroes of the time was Che Guevara, a Marxist Argentinian revolutionary that ignited several revolutionary movements in Africa and South America, and was responsible for the death of numerous people before he was killed in 1967. Che's famous mugshot, in which he looks like a rock star, excited many youngsters who wanted to follow in his path. In the 1970s, these leftist revolutionary movements, along with the PLO, turned terrorism into a global menace. The hippies generally didn't take part in this corruption, and most of them remained faithful to their pacifism. But in hippie culture itself there were also dialectic forms of thinking that led to dark places. In 1966, the Church of Satan was formed in San Francisco, asserting that Christianity is the thing that is preventing us from achieving happiness. The Satanists basically turned Christianity on its head and defined as good anything that Christianity defined as bad, focusing mainly on sensual pleasures. Some hippies, in their search for spirituality, connected to this church, as well as to all the forms of worshipping the darkness. In rock, this approach found its way into heavy metal, and employed a significant part in it. And there was one group that seems to encapsulate this entire chapter. Charles Manson was a psychopath, who found in the nonconformist hippies fertile ground to plant his violent fantasies, and in 1968 he formed a commune in California, named the Manson family. There, Manson developed a dialectic theory about an imminent race war, in which the black race will take over and eradicate the white race, leaving the Manson family, that was all white, to rule over the blacks and therefore the world. He drew from two sources, the Book of Revelation in the New Testament and the Beatles' White Album, in which every song, he claimed, contained the code that he, Manson, deciphered for his disciples. What the song said, according to his interpretation, was that they should not sit idly by and wait for the race war to erupt, but actively ignite it. In 1969, the Manson family performed a series of brutal ritualistic murders of white people, and tried to frame blacks for them. The police was baffled at first, but right at the end of the year it managed to solve the crimes and arrest the family members, putting the exclamation mark on a decade that began magically and ended drenched in blood. Moreover, this was the final shattering of the hippie dream.